At 8:07 in the evening on September 12, 1942, Kapitän Lieutenant Werner Hartenstein stood in the conning tower of U-156, approximately 300 miles northeast of Ascension Island in the South Atlantic. Through his binoculars, he could see a large passenger ship silhouetted against the moonlit horizon, traveling without escort, zigzagging on an evasive course. The ship was approximately 5 nautical miles distant, moving at approximately 15 knots. Hartenstein had been tracking this target for 2 hours. His crew was at battle stations. The forward torpedo tubes were loaded. This was what submarine commanders hunted for. An unescorted Allied merchant vessel, vulnerable, alone in the middle of the Atlantic. Hartenstein gave the order to attack. He did not know that within hours he would be coordinating the largest rescue operation ever conducted by a submarine. He did not know that his actions would result in one of the most controversial incidents of World War II. He did not know that this target would change German submarine doctrine for the rest of the war. The target was the RMS Laconia, a Cunard White Star liner of 19,940 tons, 596 feet long, built in 1922. Before the war, the Laconia had been a luxury passenger ship operating transatlantic routes. When war began in 1939, the British Admiralty requisitioned the vessel and converted it to a troop ship. The elegant staterooms were stripped out and replaced with basic bunks. The dining rooms became mess halls. The ship's peacetime capacity of 2,200 passengers was abandoned. As a troop ship, the Laconia could carry over 3,000 people in cramped conditions. On September 12, 1942, the Laconia was sailing from Suez to Liverpool via Cape Town, carrying a mixed cargo of military personnel, civilians, prisoners of war, and Polish guards. The exact number of people aboard was not precisely recorded, but manifests and survivor accounts suggest approximately 2,700 people were on the ship that night. Among the passengers were approximately 80 British military personnel, about 260 British civilians including women and children, 103 Polish guards, and the largest group, approximately 1,800 Italian prisoners of war. These Italians had been captured during the North Africa campaign and were being transported to prisoner of war camps in Britain. The Italians were held in the ship's holds below decks, confined in locked compartments, guarded by the Polish soldiers. The conditions in the holds were terrible. The ventilation was poor. The heat was oppressive. The prisoners were given minimal food and water. They were locked in cages, with no possibility of escape. International law required that prisoners of war be treated humanely and transported safely. But the reality aboard the Laconia was that the Italian prisoners were being held in conditions that would make evacuation nearly impossible if the ship was attacked. The British command knew that moving prisoners by sea through submarine-infested waters was dangerous, but the need to transport captured enemy personnel to Britain outweighed the risks. Or so they believed. Werner Hartenstein was 34 years old in September 1942. He had joined the Kriegsmarine in 1928 and transferred to the U-boat service in 1937. He had commanded U-156 since May 1941 and had conducted several successful patrols in the Atlantic and Caribbean. Hartenstein was an experienced submarine commander, professional, skilled at his job, and like most U-boat captains, he followed a strict code of conduct. German submarine doctrine in 1942 still maintained some adherence to prize rules, the traditional international laws governing naval warfare. These rules, codified in various international treaties including the London Naval Treaty of 1930, required that naval vessels attacking merchant ships give warning, allow time for evacuation, and ensure the safety of passengers and crew before sinking a vessel. In practice, these rules had been extensively violated by all sides during World War II. German U-boats routinely attacked without warning because surfacing to give warning made the submarine vulnerable to counterattack. British and American forces attacked Axis, shipping without warning for the same reason. By 1942, the concept of unrestricted submarine warfare was the operational reality, even if it violated international law. But most submarine commanders, including Hartenstein, still maintained a personal code against deliberately killing survivors. The goal was to sink ships, not murder sailors. At 8:11 in the evening, U-156 fired 2 torpedoes from the forward tubes. The range was approximately 4,000 meters. The torpedoes were Type G7E electric torpedoes, each carrying a 280-kilogram warhead, running at 30 knots at a depth of 4 meters. Hartenstein watched through his binoculars as the torpedoes ran toward the target. At 8:13, 2 explosions lit up the night. Both torpedoes struck the Laconia on the starboard side, one hitting forward near the No. 2 hold, the other striking amidships near the engine room. The explosions tore massive holes in the ship's hull below the waterline. Water flooded into the forward hold and the engine spaces. The ship's power failed immediately. The Laconia went dark. The ship began listing to starboard within minutes. Aboard U-156, Hartenstein and his crew heard the explosions through the submarine's hull. They waited, listening on hydrophones, tracking the sounds of the sinking ship. The Laconia was clearly going down. Hartenstein estimated the ship would sink within 30 minutes based on the severity of the list. He ordered U-156 to surface and approach the target to confirm the sinking. This was standard procedure. Verify the kill, identify the ship type, report the tonnage to U-boat command. At 8:25, U-156 surfaced approximately 500 meters from the Laconia. The submarine's diesel engines started. The crew opened the conning tower hatch. Hartenstein climbed onto the bridge with his watch officer and lookouts. They could see the Laconia clearly in the moonlight. The ship was listing badly, settling by the stern. And then Hartenstein heard something that changed everything. He heard voices in the water. Hundreds of voices. People were screaming in multiple languages: English, Polish, and Italian. The torpedo strikes had killed dozens of people instantly. The explosion in the forward hold had killed many of the Italian prisoners locked in cages below decks. The survivors in that hold were trapped as water flooded in. The explosion in the engine room had killed several crew members and destroyed the ship's electrical system. In the darkness, panic began immediately. The British and Polish guards tried to maintain order. The Italian prisoners, locked in their holds, realized they were trapped in a sinking ship. They began screaming, demanding to be released. The Polish guards faced a terrible decision: unlock the prisoners and risk losing control, or leave them locked and condemn them to drown. Some guards opened the locks, others did not. The result was chaos. Hundreds of Italian prisoners flooded onto the ship's decks, mixing with British military personnel and civilian passengers. In the darkness, with the ship listing, people scrambled for the lifeboats. The Laconia carried lifeboats sufficient for everyone aboard if launched properly, but proper launching required time, organization, and a relatively stable ship. The Laconia had none of these. The ship was listing so severely that lifeboats on the starboard side, the low side, swung inward and could not be launched. Lifeboats on the port side, the high side, swung outward over empty space and were difficult to board. Some boats were launched successfully. Others capsized when too many people tried to board. Others were lowered incorrectly and dumped their occupants into the ocean. Hartenstein stood on U-156's bridge and listened to the screams. He could see people in the water. He could see lifeboats. He scanned the sinking ship through his binoculars and saw people crowding the rails. And then he saw something that shocked him. He saw Italian prisoners. The voices he was hearing included Italian. These people were shouting, "Aiuto!" Help! They were shouting, "Siamo Italiani!" "We are Italian." Hartenstein realized immediately what had happened. He had torpedoed a ship carrying Italian prisoners of war. Italy was Germany's ally. These prisoners were Allied soldiers being transported by the enemy. According to the military alliance between Germany and Italy, German forces were obligated to assist Italian military personnel. Hartenstein faced a moral and military decision. He could dive and leave the area, as submarine doctrine required after an attack. Remaining on the surface near a sinking ship made U-156 vulnerable. Allied aircraft could be patrolling the area. Allied warships could be responding to distress signals. Every minute U-156 remained surfaced increased the risk to his crew and his boat. But abandoning Italian prisoners to drown while German submarines were nearby violated both his personal code and his obligations as an officer of a nation allied with Italy. Hartenstein made his decision. He would attempt a rescue. He radioed U-boat headquarters in France and reported the situation. He explained that he had sunk a British troop ship carrying Italian prisoners and was beginning rescue operations. He requested permission to conduct a rescue and asked for assistance from other U-boats in the area and from Vichy French naval forces based in West Africa. The response from U-boat headquarters was cautious. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat force, understood Hartenstein's position but also understood the risks. Dönitz authorized Hartenstein to conduct a limited rescue, but emphasized that U-156 must not endanger itself. If threatened by enemy forces, Hartenstein was to abandon the rescue and dive immediately. Dönitz also ordered other U-boats in the South Atlantic to proceed toward Hartenstein's position and assist with the rescue. He contacted Vichy French naval authorities in Dakar and requested that French warships be dispatched to take on survivors. This response set in motion one of the most unusual operations of the naval war, an Axis rescue mission to save Allied and Italian survivors of a German submarine attack. At 8:40, U-156 moved closer to the Laconia's lifeboats. Hartenstein ordered his crew to begin pulling survivors aboard. The submarine's deck was approximately 15 feet above the waterline, making rescue difficult. Survivors had to climb rope ladders or be hauled up by lines. The U-156 crew pulled exhausted people from the water, gave them blankets, water, and basic first aid, and then moved them to the submarine's deck, where they sat, packed together. Within an hour, U-156 had taken aboard approximately 200 survivors. The submarine was designed for a crew of 53. Now, it held over 250 people. Every available space on the deck was occupied. The pressure hull could not accommodate any more people below. Survivors sat on the deck, on the gun mounts, on the conning tower. Hartenstein could take no more aboard without compromising the submarine's ability to dive in an emergency. But there were still hundreds of people in the water. The Laconia was still afloat, but sinking slowly. Lifeboats were scattered across several square miles of ocean. People were floating in life jackets. People were clinging to debris. Hartenstein realized that U-156 alone could not save everyone. He needed help. At 9:15, the Laconia finally sank. The ship had remained afloat for approximately 1 hour after the torpedo strikes, long enough for most people to abandon ship. But the sinking process was chaotic, and many people died. The exact casualty count from the sinking itself is unknown, but estimates suggest approximately 400 people died in the initial sinking, either killed by the torpedo explosions, trapped below decks and drowned, or lost when lifeboats capsized. That left approximately 2,300 people in lifeboats, on rafts, or floating in the water in the middle of the South Atlantic, 300 miles from the nearest land. Without rescue, most would die within days from dehydration, exposure, or shark attacks. Hartenstein understood this. He could save a few hundred. The rest needed a proper rescue fleet. At approximately 10 in the evening on September 12th, Hartenstein made a decision that was unprecedented in submarine warfare. He broadcast an uncoded message on the International Distress Frequency in English, announcing his position and his intention to conduct a rescue operation. The message read, "If any ship will assist the shipwrecked Laconia crew, I will not attack providing I am not being attacked by ship or air forces. I picked up 193 men, 453 south, 11 to 26 west, German submarine." This message was remarkable for several reasons. First, Hartenstein was revealing his position to potential enemies. Any Allied ship or aircraft could use this information to attack U-156. Second, he was offering a temporary truce, promising not to attack ships that came to assist with the rescue. Third, he was asking enemy forces to trust a German U-boat captain's word. The message was received by multiple Allied stations, including Royal Navy Command in Freetown, Sierra Leone, and U.S. Navy Command on Ascension Island. The responses varied. Some Allied commanders considered the message a trick, a deception to lure Allied ships into a submarine ambush. Others recognized it as genuine, but were constrained by military orders that required attacking all enemy submarines on sight. The dilemma this created was profound. A German submarine was attempting to rescue Allied civilians and Axis prisoners, and Allied forces had to decide whether to assist, ignore, or attack. By midnight on September 12th, U-156 had been joined by U-506, another German submarine commanded by Kapitänleutnant Erich Werdemann. U-506 had been on patrol approximately 300 miles away when it received orders to proceed to the Laconia site and assist with rescue operations. U-506 arrived and immediately began taking survivors aboard. Like U-156, U-506 was soon overloaded with survivors. Both submarines had people packed on their decks, making them slow, unwieldy, and unable to dive quickly if attacked. Hartenstein and Werdemann discussed the situation by radio. They agreed that they needed surface ships to take the survivors. They could not carry these people thousands of miles to safety. The submarines could only hold the survivors temporarily until proper rescue vessels arrived. Hartenstein continued broadcasting his position and his offer of safe conduct. He waited for a response. On the morning of September 13th, U-507, commanded by Korvettenkapitän Harro Schacht, arrived at the rescue site. 3 German submarines were now involved in the operation, all overloaded with survivors, all vulnerable, all waiting for help. The survivors aboard the submarines included British civilians, British military personnel, Polish guards, and Italian prisoners. Former enemies sat side by side on the submarine's decks. Hartenstein's crew provided food and water to everyone. The German sailors treated the survivors humanely, regardless of nationality. One British survivor later reported that the Germans were extraordinarily kind, and that Hartenstein personally ensured that women and children received priority for food and shelter. Another survivor, a British officer, reported that Hartenstein apologized for sinking the Laconia, but explained that he had not known about the prisoners aboard. These accounts, documented after the war, paint a picture of Hartenstein as a professional naval officer attempting to mitigate the tragedy his attack had caused. Hartenstein was aware of the risk he was taking. Standing orders from U-boat headquarters required submarines to avoid remaining on the surface in daylight hours in areas where Allied aircraft might patrol. The South Atlantic was within range of Allied aircraft based on Ascension Island, approximately 300 miles to the west. These aircraft, primarily American B-24 Liberator bombers, flew anti-submarine patrols over the Atlantic shipping lanes. A submarine on the surface, especially a submarine loaded with survivors and unable to dive quickly, was an easy target. Hartenstein believed that the Red Cross flags he had displayed on U-156's conning tower and the international distress broadcasts he had transmitted would protect him from attack under international law. The Hague Convention and Geneva Convention both required combatants to respect medical and rescue operations. Attacking a vessel conducting rescue operations was a war crime. Hartenstein believed that Allied forces would respect this. He was wrong. At approximately 11:30 in the morning on September 16th, after 4 days of rescue operations, Hartenstein had collected approximately 400 survivors distributed across U-156 and the lifeboats it was towing. U-156 had attached tow lines to several lifeboats, pulling them slowly toward the expected meeting point, with Vichy French warships that were en route from Dakar. Hartenstein was on the surface, moving at slow speed, displaying Red Cross flags, towing lifeboats full of survivors. At 11:30, a lookout spotted an aircraft approaching from the west. It was an American B-24 Liberator bomber based on Ascension Island, piloted by Lieutenant James D. Harden. Harden's crew had been on anti-submarine patrol when they spotted U-156 on the surface. From the air, Harden could see the submarine, the lifeboats being towed, and people on the submarine's deck. Harden radioed his base on Ascension Island and reported the sighting. He requested instructions. The response from Ascension Island Command was unambiguous: attack the submarine. The American commander on Ascension Island, who was later identified in various accounts, but whose exact role remains disputed in historical records, ordered Harden to bomb the submarine immediately. Harden reportedly expressed concern about the people visible on the submarine and in the lifeboats. The response was that a submarine was a legitimate target, regardless of circumstances. Harden was ordered to attack. He complied with his orders. At approximately 11:45, Harden's B-24 made a bombing run on U-156. Hartenstein saw the aircraft approaching and realized immediately that it was going to attack. He ordered the tow lines to the lifeboats cut immediately. He ordered all survivors off the submarine's deck. The German crew pushed, pulled, and threw survivors back into the water or into the lifeboats. Hartenstein needed to clear the deck so he could dive if necessary. The Red Cross flags were still displayed. Hartenstein could not believe the aircraft would attack, but he prepared for the worst. Harden's B-24 dropped depth charges. The first pattern missed, falling approximately 50 meters from U-156. The explosions threw up massive columns of water. People in the lifeboats were thrown into the sea. Survivors who had just been pushed off the submarine were caught in the blast waves. Some were killed instantly. Others were injured. Hartenstein ordered emergency dive. U-156's crew scrambled below. The hatches slammed shut. The submarine crash-dived, descending as fast as possible to escape further attacks. Approximately 20 survivors who had been on the submarine's deck and could not get off in time were lost when U-156 dived. They were left floating in the water as the submarine disappeared beneath them. Harden's aircraft made a second attack run, dropping more depth charges. These fell closer to the lifeboats, killing more survivors. After the aircraft departed, survivors in the lifeboats counted the dead. The exact number killed by the American bombing is unknown, but estimates suggest approximately 50 to 60 people died in the attack, including British civilians, Italian prisoners, and Polish guards. These people survived a submarine attack, survived 4 days adrift in the Atlantic, and were killed by their own side's aircraft while being rescued. U-156 survived the attack. Hartenstein brought the submarine back to the surface after the aircraft left. He could see the carnage. Bodies floating. Overturned lifeboats. Survivors screaming for help. Hartenstein radioed U-boat headquarters and reported what had happened. He stated that he had been attacked while displaying Red Cross markings and conducting a rescue operation. He reported that Allied aircraft had bombed survivors in lifeboats. He asked for orders. The response from Dönitz was immediate. Abort the rescue. All U-boats involved in the Laconia rescue were ordered to abandon survivors and leave the area immediately. Dönitz could not risk losing more submarines. Hartenstein complied. U-156 departed, leaving hundreds of survivors in lifeboats. U-506 and U-507, which had not been attacked but were aware of the bombing of U-156, also withdrew. The German rescue operation ended. The survivors were alone again. However, the Vichy French warships that Dönitz had requested were still en route. On September 17th, the French cruiser Gloire and the sloops Dumont d'Urville and Annamite arrived at the rescue site. These ships had sailed from Dakar, approximately 1,500 miles to the northeast, and reached the survivors approximately 5 days after the Laconia sank. The French ships found lifeboats scattered over a wide area. They began picking up survivors systematically. The French sailors pulled exhausted people from lifeboats, gave them food, water, and medical care, and transported them to ports in French West Africa. The French rescue continued for several days, covering hundreds of square miles of ocean. By September 20th, the French ships had recovered approximately 1,100 survivors. The final tally of the Laconia disaster took months to compile. Approximately 2,700 people had been aboard the Laconia when it was torpedoed. Approximately 1,583 people died. Approximately 1,117 survived. Of the survivors, approximately 450 were Italian prisoners. Approximately 350 were British military and civilians. Approximately 250 were Polish guards, and the remainder were crew members. Over half the people aboard died. Most of the dead were Italian prisoners who had been trapped below decks when the torpedoes struck, or who drowned in the chaos of the sinking. The British casualties included women and children. The Polish guards suffered heavy losses. The crew of the Laconia, who were trained in evacuation procedures and knew the ship's layout, had higher survival rates than passengers. The statistics reveal the brutal calculus of maritime disasters. Those trapped below decks die, those who reach lifeboats live, and luck determines who ends up in which category. The Laconia incident had immediate consequences for German submarine warfare. On September 17, 1942, Admiral Dönitz issued what became known as the Laconia Order. This order, transmitted to all U-boat commanders, stated, "No attempt of any kind must be made at rescuing members of ships sunk, and this includes picking up persons in the water and putting them in lifeboats, righting capsized lifeboats, and handing over food and water. Rescue runs counter to the rudimentary demands of warfare for the destruction of enemy ships and crews. Be hard. Remember that the enemy takes no regard of women and children in his attacks on German cities." This order was a fundamental change in German submarine doctrine. It explicitly forbade U-boat commanders from conducting any rescue operations. It required submarines to attack ships and leave the survivors to their fate. The order was justified by Dönitz as necessary to protect German submarines from attack while conducting rescues, as had happened to U-156, but the order also reflected a hardening of attitudes in the naval war. By late 1942, the concept of chivalry in naval warfare was dead. The Laconia Order codified this reality. The Laconia Order was controversial even within the German Navy. Some U-boat commanders agreed with it, arguing that submarines could not risk exposure by conducting rescues. Others felt it violated basic maritime traditions. Hartenstein himself reportedly opposed the order, but followed it for the remainder of his career. The order remained in effect for the rest of the war. After the war, the Laconia Order became evidence in the Nuremberg trials. Dönitz was prosecuted for issuing an order that allegedly constituted a war crime. The prosecution argued that the order encouraged or required U-boat commanders to murder survivors, violating international law. Dönitz's defense argued that the order was a legitimate response to Allied attacks on submarines conducting rescues, as demonstrated by the bombing of U-156. The defense also argued that Allied submarine forces followed similar policies, pointing to evidence that American submarines in the Pacific rarely rescued survivors of Japanese ships they sank. The Nuremberg Tribunal's judgment on the Laconia Order was nuanced. The tribunal found that the order itself was not illegal. Submarines were not required under international law to rescue survivors if doing so endangered the submarine. The tribunal noted that Allied submarines followed similar policies. However, the tribunal also found that the wording of the Laconia order was ambiguous and could be interpreted as encouraging the killing of survivors, which would be a war crime. The tribunal concluded that the evidence did not show that German U-boat commanders had systematically murdered survivors after the Laconia order was issued. But the tribunal convicted Dönitz on other charges related to unrestricted submarine warfare. Dönitz was sentenced to 10 years in prison, served his sentence, and was released in 1956. He maintained until his death in 1980 that the Laconia order was a legitimate military directive, and that the Laconia Incident proved that conducting rescues endangered submarines. Werner Hartenstein did not survive the war. On March 4, 1943, approximately 6 months after the Laconia Incident, U-156 was sunk by an American aircraft off Barbados. All hands were lost, including Hartenstein. He was 35 years old. After the war, survivors of the Laconia Incident gave testimony about Hartenstein's conduct during the rescue. Multiple survivors, both British and Italian, stated that Hartenstein had treated them humanely, provided food and water, and attempted to save as many people as possible. One British survivor wrote that Hartenstein was a brave and honorable man who had risked his life and his submarine to rescue enemy civilians. An Italian survivor stated that Hartenstein had saved hundreds of Italian prisoners who would otherwise have drowned. These testimonies painted Hartenstein as a principled officer who tried to follow international law and maritime tradition even in the brutal context of total war. His decision to conduct the rescue operation, knowing the risks, demonstrated a moral courage that transcended national allegiances. The American pilot who bombed U-156, Lieutenant James D. Harden, was following orders. After the war, Harden stated in interviews that he had been ordered to attack the submarine, and had complied with those orders despite seeing people on the submarine and in lifeboats. He expressed regret for the deaths caused by his attack, but maintained that he was following lawful military orders. The American command structure that issued the order to attack U-156 has been the subject of historical debate. Some accounts blame the base commander on Ascension Island. Other accounts suggest that the order came from higher authority. The exact chain of command and decision-making process has never been fully documented. What is clear is that American forces on Ascension Island knew that U-156 was conducting a rescue operation, knew that survivors were aboard the submarine and in tow, and decided that sinking the submarine was more important than protecting the survivors. This decision can be understood in the context of total war, where military necessity overrides humanitarian considerations. But it remains morally troubling. The Vichy French role in the Laconia Incident is often overlooked. The French warships that rescued over 1,000 survivors acted under orders from Vichy French Naval Command, which was technically neutral, but cooperated with Germany under the terms of the Franco-German Armistice of 1940. The French ships sailed over 1,500 miles to reach the survivors, conducted an extensive search and rescue operation, and transported the survivors to French West African ports. The French sailors involved in the rescue treated all survivors equally, regardless of nationality. After the war, some of the Laconia survivors expressed gratitude to the French Navy for saving their lives. The French contribution to the rescue operation demonstrated that even in the complicated politics of Vichy France, naval tradition and humanitarian duty could override political allegiance. The Italian prisoners aboard the Laconia were in the most vulnerable position throughout the disaster. They had been locked in holds below decks, treated as cargo, given minimal food and water. When the torpedoes struck, many were killed instantly or trapped and drowned. Those who reached the deck faced hostility from some British and Polish personnel who saw them as enemy combatants, not shipwreck victims. In the lifeboats and on the submarines, Italian prisoners and Allied personnel sat together, united by the common struggle for survival. After rescue, the Italian prisoners were taken to prisoner-of-war camps in West Africa. Many remained in captivity until Italy surrendered to the Allies in September 1943. Some of these prisoners were later repatriated to Italy. Others were eventually transferred to American or British custody. The Italian prisoners who survived the Laconia incident had experienced the full horror of maritime disaster compounded by their status as prisoners. They owed their lives to a German submarine commander who risked his boat to save them, to French sailors who pulled them from the ocean, and to luck. The broader implications of the Laconia incident for international law are significant. The incident demonstrated the breakdown of traditional maritime law during World War II. The rules that had governed naval warfare for centuries, the requirement to warn before attack, to ensure the safety of survivors, to respect rescue operations, were incompatible with the technology and tactics of submarine warfare. Submarines operated by stealth. Surfacing to give warning eliminated the submarine's advantage and made it vulnerable. Conducting rescues exposed submarines to attack, as U-156 discovered. The result was that submarines on all sides abandoned the old rules and adopted unrestricted warfare. The Laconia incident was the most dramatic example of this transformation, but it was not unique. Throughout the war, submarines sank ships without warning and left survivors to die. The moral responsibility for this shift is shared by all combatants. Germany issued the Laconia Order, but Allied submarines followed similar policies. The difference is that Germany's policy was explicit and documented, while Allied policies were implicit and unwritten. The post-war legal treatment of the Laconia Order at Nuremberg revealed the difficulty of applying international law to the realities of submarine warfare. The tribunal struggled to distinguish between legitimate military necessity and war crimes. The conclusion that the Laconia Order itself was not illegal, but could be interpreted as encouraging illegal conduct, was an acknowledgement that international law had not kept pace with military technology. The tribunal's decision to convict Dönitz on other charges while essentially excusing the Laconia Order was controversial. Some legal scholars argued that the tribunal should have condemned all forms of unrestricted submarine warfare as illegal. Others argued that the tribunal correctly recognized that submarines could not be held to standards designed for surface ships. The debate continues among international law scholars today. The survivors of the Laconia incident scattered across the world after the war. Some wrote memoirs or gave interviews describing their experiences. These accounts provide valuable historical detail, but also reveal the psychological impact of the disaster. Survivors described the terror of the torpedo explosions, the chaos of the sinking, the days adrift in lifeboats, the shock of being bombed by friendly aircraft, and the relief of being rescued. Many survivors suffered from post-traumatic stress. Some had survivor's guilt, wondering why they lived while others died. A few survivors, both British and Italian, corresponded with each other after the war, united by their shared experience. One survivor group organized reunions in the 1960s and 70s, bringing together British, Italian, and Polish survivors to commemorate the incident and honor the dead. Werner Hartenstein's widow, after the war, received letters from British survivors of the Laconia, thanking her late husband for his efforts to save them. These letters are preserved in German naval archives and represent an unusual acknowledgement of an enemy commander's humanity. One letter, from a British woman whose children were saved by Hartenstein's rescue operation, stated, "Your husband was a brave and decent man who tried to do the right thing in terrible circumstances. I am sorry for your loss and grateful for his courage." Such sentiments were rare in the immediate post-war period, when bitterness and anger dominated public attitudes toward former enemies. But the Laconia incident was exceptional enough that some survivors felt compelled to acknowledge Hartenstein's actions. The Laconia wreck lies at a depth of approximately 15,000 feet in the South Atlantic. The exact location was not precisely recorded at the time of sinking, and the wreck has never been located. The depth makes exploration prohibitively expensive. The wreck remains a grave site for the approximately 1,500 people who died in the disaster. No memorial marks the site. The Laconia incident is not widely known outside naval history circles. It lacks the dramatic imagery of famous disasters like the Titanic or the Lusitania. But among historians of submarine warfare, the Laconia incident is recognized as one of the most significant events of the Battle of the Atlantic, not because of the number of casualties, which was relatively modest compared to other maritime disasters, but because of its impact on naval doctrine and international law. The moral questions raised by the Laconia incident remain unresolved. Was Hartenstein right to conduct the rescue operation despite the risk to his submarine and crew? Was the American command right to order the attack on U-156 despite knowing it was conducting a rescue? Was Dönitz right to issue the Laconia order prohibiting future rescues? These questions have no clear answers. Hartenstein followed his conscience and maritime tradition, but his decision endangered his boat and ultimately failed to save most of the survivors. The American command followed military doctrine, prioritizing the destruction of enemy submarines, but their decision resulted in the deaths of Allied civilians. Dönitz followed military logic by prohibiting rescues that endangered submarines, but his order codified the abandonment of humanitarian principles. Each decision can be justified within its context. Each decision can be condemned from a different perspective. The Laconia incident demonstrates the moral complexity of warfare and the impossibility of maintaining ethical clarity when survival and duty conflict. The impact of the Laconia incident on subsequent submarine operations was profound. After September 1942, German U-boats avoided rescue operations. Survivors of torpedoed ships were left to drift. Lifeboats were not approached. Distress calls were ignored. This policy saved submarines from attack, but condemned thousands of merchant sailors and passengers to death by drowning, dehydration, or exposure. Allied submarines followed similar policies throughout the war. American submarines in the Pacific sank Japanese merchant ships and left survivors without rescue. British submarines in the Mediterranean attacked Axis shipping and departed without assisting survivors. By the war's end, the concept of rescuing survivors of submarine attacks had been abandoned by all sides. The Laconia incident was the turning point that made this abandonment explicit policy rather than reluctant practice. After World War II, international maritime law was revised to address the problems revealed by incidents like the Laconia. The Geneva Conventions of 1949 included new provisions regarding the treatment of shipwreck survivors and prisoners of war being transported by sea. The conventions required that prisoners be transported in clearly marked ships, that sufficient lifeboats and safety equipment be provided, that prisoners have access to evacuation routes, and that transporting powers notify enemy forces of prisoner transport ships to avoid attacks. These provisions were specifically designed to prevent another Laconia incident. However, the conventions did not resolve the fundamental problem of submarine warfare. Submarines still operate by stealth. Surfacing to rescue survivors still exposes submarines to attack. The technology and tactics of submarine warfare remain incompatible with humanitarian principles. Modern international law recognizes this reality and does not require submarines to conduct rescues if doing so would endanger the submarine. The Laconia incident taught the international community that some forms of warfare cannot be made humane. The personal stories within the Laconia incident reveal the human cost of maritime warfare. Among the British civilian passengers were families evacuating from Egypt, where they had lived before the war. Women and children, who had spent years in the relative safety of colonial life, found themselves in lifeboats in the South Atlantic, clinging to survival. One woman survivor reported that she held her 2 young children in a lifeboat for 4 days, rationing the small amount of water they had, watching other people around her die from dehydration. She was rescued by the French cruiser Gloire and survived, but both her children died shortly after rescue from the effects of exposure. This woman's story, documented in a 1950s interview, illustrates the arbitrary cruelty of maritime disasters. She survived the torpedo attack, the sinking 4 days adrift, and rescue, only to lose her children to the delayed effects of exposure. Her grief was compounded by the knowledge that the German submarine had attempted a rescue that might have saved her children if not interrupted by the bombing. Among the Italian prisoners were soldiers who had surrendered in North Africa, believing they would be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Instead, they were locked in ships' holds, transported in inhumane conditions, torpedoed by their allies' submarine, and left to drown or survive by chance. One Italian survivor, interviewed in the 1960s, stated that he had believed the British would protect prisoners according to international law. The Laconia experience taught him that international law meant nothing when military necessity intervened. He survived by breaking out of the locked hold after the torpedoes struck, swimming through flooded corridors in darkness, reaching the deck, and jumping into the ocean. He floated in a life jacket for 2 days before being picked up by U-506. He spent 3 days on the submarine's deck before being transferred to a French ship. He was eventually repatriated to Italy in 1944 after Italy surrendered. His account emphasizes the helplessness of prisoners in maritime warfare and the randomness of survival. Among the Polish guards were soldiers who had escaped Poland after the German invasion in 1939, joined the Polish forces in exile, and ended up guarding Italian prisoners on a British troopship in 1942. These men had already experienced one catastrophic military defeat and were now involved in another disaster. The Polish guards faced impossible choices during the Laconia sinking: unlock the prisoners and risk losing control, or leave them locked and condemn them to death. Different guards made different choices. Those who unlocked the prisoners saved lives but violated their orders. Those who kept the prisoners locked followed orders but caused deaths. After the sinking, Polish survivors in lifeboats had to coexist with Italian prisoners they had been guarding. The normal hierarchy of guard and prisoner dissolved in the shared struggle for survival. Polish and Italian survivors later reported that national and military distinctions became irrelevant in the lifeboats. Everyone was simply trying to survive. This temporary erasure of wartime enmities, forced by circumstance, did not last beyond rescue, but it demonstrated that the categories of enemy and ally are contextual and can be overridden by more fundamental human imperatives. The crew of the Laconia, approximately 350 merchant sailors and naval personnel, were trained professionals who understood maritime emergencies. Their training and discipline gave them higher survival rates than passengers. The crew knew where the lifeboats were, how to launch them, how to survive at sea, but even trained sailors died in the chaos. The captain of the Laconia, Captain Rudolf Sharp, went down with his ship, following the maritime tradition that the captain is last to leave. Sharp had commanded the Laconia since 1941 and had successfully completed multiple voyages transporting troops and supplies. On September 12, 1942, he was on the bridge when the torpedoes struck. He immediately ordered the crew to prepare lifeboats and sent distress signals. He remained on the bridge as the ship sank, ensuring that evacuation proceeded as orderly as possible. Survivors reported seeing Sharp on the bridge as the water rose around him. He made no attempt to save himself. Sharp's death was consistent with naval tradition, but it also demonstrated the psychological burden of command. As captain, Sharp was responsible for everyone aboard. When the ship was lost and hundreds died, Sharp apparently felt that abandoning ship would be abandoning his responsibility. His decision to die with the Laconia was personal, but it reflects a broader understanding of duty that transcends survival instinct. The technical details of the Laconia sinking reveal the effectiveness of German torpedoes and the vulnerability of unescorted ships. The Type G7E torpedoes that hit the Laconia were among the most reliable weapons in the Kriegsmarine's arsenal. Each torpedo weighed approximately 1,500 kilograms, carried a 280-kilogram hexanite warhead, and ran at 30 knots with a range of approximately 5,000 meters. The torpedoes were set to detonate on contact, and both strikes hit below the waterline, precisely where they would cause maximum flooding. The Laconia's hull was not armored. Passenger liners converted to troop ships retained their civilian construction, which prioritized capacity and comfort over survivability. When the torpedoes struck, the hull plating ruptured easily, and water flooded the interior compartments rapidly. The ship's watertight doors closed automatically, but the damage was too extensive. The forward hold flooded completely within 10 minutes. The engine room flooded within 15 minutes. The ship developed a severe list as water accumulated on the starboard side. The list made launching lifeboats on the starboard side impossible, and made launching lifeboats on the port side extremely difficult. Naval architects analyzing the sinking after the war concluded that the Laconia was doomed from the moment the torpedoes struck. No damage control measures could have saved the ship. The only question was how much time passengers would have to evacuate. The comparison between the Laconia incident and other famous maritime disasters reveals important differences. The Titanic sank in 1912 after hitting an iceberg, killing approximately 1,500 people. The disaster occurred in peacetime, received massive international attention, and led to significant improvements in maritime safety regulations. The Lusitania was torpedoed by a German U-boat in 1915, killing approximately 1,200 people, including American civilians. The disaster influenced American public opinion and contributed to the United States entering World War I. The Laconia incident killed approximately 1,500 people, comparable to both the Titanic and Lusitania disasters, but received little international attention at the time and is largely forgotten today. The difference is context. The Titanic was a peacetime disaster that shocked a world accustomed to safe transatlantic travel. The Lusitania was a wartime attack that crossed moral lines by killing civilians. The Laconia was a wartime attack that occurred when maritime warfare had already become brutal and total. By 1942, ships were being sunk by the dozens every month in the Atlantic. The death of 1,500 people on the Laconia was tragic, but not exceptional. The incident became significant not because of the casualties but because of the rescue attempt and the subsequent bombing. The moral complexity of the Laconia incident distinguishes it from simpler tragedies. The role of chance in survival during the Laconia incident cannot be overstated. People survived or died based on random factors: which part of the ship they were in when the torpedoes struck, whether they reached the deck before the ship sank, whether they found space in a lifeboat, whether they were picked up by a submarine before the bombing, whether they were rescued by the French ships. Survivors interviewed after the war frequently mentioned luck as the primary factor in their survival. One survivor stated, "I lived because I happened to be on the deck when the torpedoes hit. If I had been below decks, I would have died. It was that simple." Another survivor said, "I survived because a German sailor pulled me out of the water onto the submarine. 5 minutes later, the submarine dived, and everyone still in the water was left behind. I was lucky. Others were not." The randomness of survival in maritime disasters is morally troubling because it suggests that individual agency, skill, and virtue are irrelevant. Good people and bad people, strong and weak, trained and untrained, all have roughly equal chances of survival determined primarily by circumstance. This randomness contradicts the human desire to believe that survival is earned or deserved. The Laconia survivors understood that they lived not because they were better or more deserving, but because chance placed them in the right place at the right moment. The question of whether Hartenstein should have attacked the Laconia at all is complicated by the realities of submarine warfare in 1942. Hartenstein did not know that the Laconia was carrying Italian prisoners. The ship was not marked as a prisoner transport. International law required that ships carrying prisoners be marked with distinctive signals and that enemy forces be notified of prisoner transports to avoid attacks. The British did not mark the Laconia as a prisoner transport and did not notify Axis forces of the ship's cargo. From Hartenstein's perspective, the Laconia was an unescorted Allied merchant vessel, a legitimate target. The rules of submarine warfare in 1942 allowed attacks on unescorted merchant ships without warning. Hartenstein followed these rules when he torpedoed the Laconia. The tragedy resulted from the British decision to transport prisoners on an unmarked ship through submarine-infested waters. This decision violated the spirit, if not the letter of international law regarding prisoner transport. The British command prioritized operational security over prisoner safety, reasoning that marking the ship as a prisoner transport might not guarantee protection and would reveal information about troop movements. This reasoning was not unreasonable given the state of total war in 1942, but it resulted in the prisoners being placed in extreme danger. The aftermath of the Laconia incident included diplomatic complications involving multiple nations. Britain protested the initial submarine attack, but could not effectively protest the rescue operation without acknowledging that Hartenstein had acted humanely. Italy thanked Germany for attempting to rescue Italian prisoners, but criticized the incomplete success of the operation. Vichy France claimed credit for rescuing over 1,000 survivors, but faced criticism from both Allied and Axis powers for its ambiguous political position. The United States defended the bombing of U-156 as a legitimate attack on an enemy submarine, but faced private criticism from British survivors who had been aboard the submarine at the time. These diplomatic complexities prevented any clear international consensus on the lessons of the Laconia incident. Each nation interpreted the incident according to its own interests and perspective. The long-term impact of the Laconia order on naval warfare extended beyond World War II. During the Cold War, submarine doctrine for both NATO and Warsaw Pact forces assumed that submarines would not conduct rescue operations after attacks. The understanding was that modern submarines, especially nuclear-powered submarines, operated independently in hostile environments where surfacing to rescue survivors would be suicidal. The abandonment of rescue obligations became accepted naval practice. Post-Cold War international law has not challenged this practice. The result is that the Laconia incident's primary legacy is the normalization of submarine warfare without humanitarian constraints. Modern submarine commanders understand that if they sink a ship, they will not rescue survivors. This understanding is shared by potential victims. Merchant sailors and naval personnel understand that if their ship is sunk by a submarine, they cannot expect rescue from the attacker. This mutual understanding represents a fundamental departure from centuries of maritime tradition, and the Laconia incident was the pivotal event that made this departure explicit and accepted. Werner Hartenstein's legacy is complicated by his role as both attacker and rescuer. He sank the Laconia, causing 1,500 deaths. He then attempted to rescue survivors, saving several hundred lives. He was attacked while conducting the rescue, which led to additional deaths. He was ordered to abandon the rescue, which he did, leaving hundreds more to uncertain fates. Each of Hartenstein's actions can be evaluated separately, and different evaluations yield different moral conclusions. As an attacker, Hartenstein was doing his job as a submarine commander, following orders, contributing to the German war effort. His attack was legal under the rules of unrestricted submarine warfare that governed operations in 1942. As a rescuer, Hartenstein was following maritime tradition and humanitarian impulse, risking his submarine and crew to save enemy civilians and Allied prisoners. His rescue attempt was admirable and courageous. As a victim of the bombing, Hartenstein was unjustly attacked while conducting a lawful rescue operation under Red Cross protection. The attack on U-156 was arguably a war crime. As an officer following the Laconia order, Hartenstein abandoned survivors when ordered to do so, prioritizing his submarine's safety over humanitarian concerns. This decision was militarily sound, but morally troubling. Which of these evaluations defines Hartenstein's legacy? The answer depends on which actions and which values are prioritized. Naval historians tend to remember Hartenstein as a courageous officer who tried to do the right thing in impossible circumstances. Legal scholars remember him as a defendant in a case about the limits of submarine warfare. Survivors remember him as the man who pulled them from the ocean or as the man who torpedoed their ship. All these memories are valid. All are incomplete. The Laconia Incident demonstrates the impossibility of maintaining traditional codes of honor in modern technological warfare. The submarine as a weapon system is incompatible with humanitarian rescue operations. The submarine's survival depends on stealth and the ability to dive quickly. Conducting rescues compromises both. Hartenstein attempted to reconcile submarine warfare with humanitarian duty and discovered that the two cannot coexist. His attempt ended with U-156 being bombed, survivors being killed, and German submarine doctrine abandoning all rescue obligations. The lesson of the Laconia Incident is that certain forms of warfare destroy the ethical frameworks that societies build to limit violence. Submarines are designed to attack without warning and escape before retaliation. This design makes them extraordinarily effective weapons, but also makes them incompatible with the laws and customs of war developed for surface combat. The Laconia Incident was the moment when this incompatibility became undeniable. The survivors who testified about Hartenstein after the war described him as professional, courteous, and concerned for their welfare. He spoke English fluently, having lived in Argentina before the war, and communicated easily with British survivors. He organized the distribution of food and water aboard U-156, ensuring that women and children received priority. He personally assisted injured survivors. He apologized for the attack, explaining that he had not known about the prisoners. One survivor recalled Hartenstein saying, "This is war. I am sorry, but I was following orders. Now I will do what I can to help you." This apology, if accurately remembered, reveals Hartenstein's understanding of his dual role as both cause of the disaster and potential savior. He recognized that he was responsible for the attack, but also believed that he had a duty to mitigate the consequences. This belief motivated his rescue attempt and distinguished him from U-boat commanders who would have simply attacked and departed. The Italian prisoners who survived the Laconia Incident had a unique perspective on Axis cooperation. They had been captured by British forces, held in prisoner-of-war camps in Egypt, transported aboard a British ship in terrible conditions, torpedoed by a German submarine, rescued by that same submarine, bombed by American aircraft while being rescued, and finally saved by French ships. This sequence of events demonstrated the chaos and moral ambiguity of multi-sided warfare. The Italians owed their lives to Germans who had torpedoed them, to French who rescued them despite being technically aligned with Germany under the Vichy regime, and to chance. Some Italian survivors reported feeling betrayed by their German allies who torpedoed them, grateful to the German submariners who rescued them, and confused by the political situation that created such contradictions. One Italian survivor stated in an interview, "I did not understand who was friend and who was enemy. The Germans sank our ship but then saved us. The Americans bombed us while we were being rescued. The French saved us even though they were not involved in the battle. Nothing made sense." This confusion reflected the larger moral confusion of World War II, where alliances shifted, enemies cooperated, and the categories of right and wrong became blurred. The Polish guards who survived faced their own moral reckoning. Those who had unlocked the Italian prisoners during the sinking felt they had done the right thing by saving lives, but they had also violated orders and potentially endangered British and Polish personnel by releasing enemy prisoners. Those who had kept the prisoners locked felt they had followed orders but were haunted by the knowledge that prisoners under their guard had drowned while locked in cages. Neither group of guards could claim moral certainty. The situation forced on them by the torpedoing of the Laconia required impossible choices, and both choices had terrible consequences. One Polish survivor wrote after the war that he had unlocked the prisoners in his charge and watched them escape to the deck. Some of these prisoners survived. Others drowned in the lifeboats. The guard wrote, "I do not know if I did the right thing. I saved some by unlocking them, but I may have caused others to die by creating more chaos. I think about this often and have no answer." This statement captures the moral paralysis created by the Laconia Incident, where every action led to death and survival was determined by chance rather than choice. The British military personnel aboard the Laconia were mostly support troops, not frontline combat soldiers. They were traveling to Britain for reassignment or training. They were not expecting combat. When the torpedoes struck, they responded with training and discipline, helping to launch lifeboats, maintaining order, assisting civilians. Many died doing their duty. One British Army captain survived and reported that he helped launch a lifeboat, ensured that women and children boarded first, and then remained on deck helping others until the ship sank under him. He was pulled from the water by U-156's crew and spent 2 days on the submarine before being transferred to a French ship. He wrote in his report that the German sailors treated him with respect and provided him with food, water, and a blanket. He stated that he was surprised by the humanity shown by the enemy and that the experience changed his understanding of warfare. This captain's account, like many survivor testimonies, emphasized that individual human decency could persist even in the brutal context of total war. The technical investigation of the Laconia incident by naval authorities after the war focused on identifying failures in procedures and equipment that contributed to the high casualty rate. Investigators noted that the lifeboats were adequate in number, but many could not be launched due to the severe list of the ship. They recommended that future troop ships maintain better stability after torpedo strikes, though this recommendation was impractical given the limitations of ship design. Investigators also noted that the lack of clear marking of the Laconia as a prisoner transport contributed to the attack. They recommended that all ships carrying prisoners of war be clearly marked and that enemy forces be notified of prisoner transports. This recommendation was incorporated into the revised Geneva Conventions after the war. Investigators further noted that the decision to transport prisoners through submarine-infested waters without escort was questionable. They recommended that prisoner transports receive priority for naval escort. This recommendation was also adopted post-war, but came too late for the Laconia victims. The question of whether the American bombing of U-156 was justified under international law was debated by legal scholars after the war. Those arguing that the attack was justified pointed out that U-156 was a legitimate military target, that the state of war between the United States and Germany meant that all German military vessels could be attacked on sight, and that the presence of survivors aboard or near the submarine did not grant it immunity from attack. Those arguing that the attack was unjustified pointed out that U-156 was displaying Red Cross markings, was conducting a rescue operation, and that attacking a vessel engaged in rescue violates the Hague Convention and customary international law. The debate was never resolved definitively. The American command's decision to attack U-156 was consistent with military necessity and the principle that submarines are always legitimate targets. but the decision was inconsistent with humanitarian law and the principle that rescue operations must be protected. Both principles are part of international law, and they conflict in cases like the Laconia Incident. The conflict demonstrates the inadequacy of international law to address the realities of submarine warfare. The survivors who were in the lifeboats when the American aircraft bombed them experienced a unique trauma. They had survived a submarine attack, spent days adrift in the Atlantic, and were being rescued when their own side's aircraft attacked them. The psychological impact of this sequence was devastating. One survivor stated, "I thought we were saved when the submarine took us aboard. Then the plane came and bombed us. I was thrown into the water again. People around me were killed. I did not understand why our own aircraft would attack us. I felt abandoned by everyone." Another survivor reported having nightmares for decades after the war about being bombed by friendly aircraft. The phenomenon of friendly fire causing psychological trauma is well documented in military psychology. But the Laconia Incident represents an especially cruel variant because the victims were non-combatant civilians being rescued when attacked by their own side. The Vichy French naval commanders who ordered the rescue mission from Dakar faced political risks. Vichy France was technically neutral, but cooperated with Germany under the Armistice Agreement. Sending warships to rescue survivors of a German submarine attack could be interpreted as assisting the Axis. But refusing to conduct the rescue would violate naval tradition and humanitarian duty. The French commanders decided that humanitarian considerations outweighed political risks. They dispatched the cruiser Gloire and 2 sloops to the rescue site and conducted a thorough search and rescue operation. After the war, these commanders were not prosecuted for collaboration, in part because their rescue of Allied survivors demonstrated that their actions were humanitarian rather than political. The French rescue operation was the most successful part of the entire Laconia incident, saving over 1,000 lives. Yet it is often overlooked in historical accounts that focus on the German submarine actions. The technological limitations of naval aviation in 1942 contributed to the tragedy of the Laconia incident. The American B-24 that bombed U-156 was operating at the extreme limit of its range from Ascension Island. The aircraft had limited time over the target area and could not loiter to assess the situation carefully. The pilot, Lieutenant Harden, saw a submarine on the surface and received orders to attack. From the altitude at which the B-24 was flying, approximately 5,000 feet, Harden could see people on the submarine and in lifeboats, but he could not distinguish between German crew, Allied survivors, or Italian prisoners. He could not see the Red Cross markings clearly. He had minutes to make a decision. His orders were clear: attack the submarine. If Harden had had more time, better visibility, or more detailed information, he might have recognized that the submarine was conducting a rescue. But the technology and tactics of anti-submarine warfare in 1942 did not allow for careful assessment. Aircraft attacked submarines immediately upon sighting them because any delay gave the submarine time to dive and escape. This tactical reality meant that submarines conducting rescues were vulnerable to attack even when their humanitarian purpose was evident. The broader strategic context of the Battle of the Atlantic in September 1942 helps explain why the Laconia incident occurred. By mid-1942, the Atlantic was a killing zone. German U-boats were sinking Allied merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. The Allies were losing the tonnage war. Hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping were being sunk every month. The Allies desperately needed to sink more U-boats and protect more merchant ships. In this context, every U-boat sunk was a strategic victory. When U-156 surfaced to conduct a rescue, it became vulnerable. The American command on Ascension Island saw an opportunity to destroy a U-boat and took it. The decision prioritized strategic necessity over humanitarian considerations. This prioritization was consistent with total war doctrine, which holds that winning the war justifies actions that would be unacceptable in peacetime. The Laconia Incident is a case study in how total war erodes moral constraints. Werner Hartenstein's decision to broadcast an uncoded distress message offering safe conduct to any ship that would assist with rescue was unprecedented. No U-boat commander before or after the Laconia incident made a similar offer. Hartenstein's message essentially asked enemy forces to trust him, a German U-boat captain, to honor a temporary truce. The trust required was extraordinary. Allied ships responding to Hartenstein's message would be sailing toward a German submarine, potentially into an ambush. Hartenstein was asking Allied commanders to believe that he was sincere, that he would not attack ships coming to assist, and that the rescue operation was genuine. Some Allied commanders did believe him. Others did not. The fact that Hartenstein's offer was ultimately violated, not by him, but by Allied aircraft attacking him, demonstrates the breakdown of trust in total war. Hartenstein tried to create a temporary space of humanitarian cooperation in the middle of a war zone. The attempt failed because the institutional logic of total war does not permit such spaces. The survivors who were rescued by the French ships and taken to ports in French West Africa faced uncertain fates. British military personnel and civilians were eventually repatriated to Britain via circuitous routes that avoided active war zones. The journey took months. Italian prisoners were held in French prisoner-of-war camps in West Africa until Italy surrendered in September 1943, after which they were transferred to Allied custody. Polish guards were reassigned to other units of the Polish forces in exile. The process of accounting for survivors, identifying the dead, notifying families, and processing the aftermath of the disaster continued for over a year. The British Admiralty conducted an internal investigation into the loss of the Laconia, focusing on the decision to transport prisoners on an unmarked ship through submarine-infested waters. The investigation concluded that the decision had been justified by operational necessity, but recommended changes to future prisoner transport procedures. These recommendations were implemented too late to affect the war, but became part of post-war maritime law. The Laconia incident influenced submarine doctrine not only for Germany, but for all naval powers. After the war, the navies of Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union all adopted policies similar to the Laconia Order, though not stated as explicitly. The understanding was that submarines could not be expected to rescue survivors of ships they sank. This understanding became formalized in naval doctrine and remains in effect today. Modern international law recognizes that submarines operate under constraints that make rescue operations impractical. The law of naval warfare, as codified in the San Remo Manual on International Law applicable to armed conflicts at sea, published in 1994, states that submarines are not required to rescue survivors if doing so would endanger the submarine. This provision is a direct legacy of the Laconia incident. The incident taught the international community that requiring submarines to conduct rescues is unrealistic and would simply result in submarines being lost while attempting rescues. The lesson was that humanitarian goals must sometimes yield to military reality. The memory of the Laconia incident faded quickly after the war. The incident was overshadowed by larger events and more famous battles. The Battle of the Atlantic involved thousands of ships and submarines, millions of tons of shipping, and tens of thousands of casualties. The loss of the Laconia and 1,500 lives was statistically minor in this context. The incident was also morally ambiguous, which made it difficult to fit into simplified narratives of heroes and villains. Hartenstein was neither a hero nor a villain. He was a submarine commander who attacked an enemy ship and then tried to rescue the survivors, only to be attacked himself. This complexity made the Laconia incident unsuitable for propaganda or commemoration. After the war, survivors occasionally wrote about their experiences, but these accounts reached small audiences. The incident remained obscure until the 1960s, when historians of submarine warfare began studying it in detail. Even today, the Laconia Incident is not widely known outside academic and naval circles. The personal correspondence between survivors and Hartenstein's widow after the war provides some of the most poignant documents related to the Laconia Incident. British survivors who had been rescued by Hartenstein wrote to his widow expressing gratitude for his efforts and condolences for his death. These letters, preserved in German archives, demonstrate that some survivors distinguished between Hartenstein as the attacker who sank their ship and Hartenstein as the rescuer who tried to save them. One letter, written by a British woman in 1954, stated, "I know that your husband attacked our ship and many people died, but I also know that he tried to save us afterward. He was kind to me and my children. When he was killed, the war took a good man. I am sorry for your loss." This letter is remarkable for its ability to hold two contradictory truths simultaneously. Hartenstein was responsible for deaths, and Hartenstein tried to prevent deaths. Both are true. Both define his legacy. The question of whether more could have been done to save Laconia survivors remains unanswerable. If the British had marked the Laconia as a prisoner transport, Hartenstein might not have attacked it. But marking the ship would have revealed information about troop movements. If Hartenstein had not conducted the rescue, hundreds of survivors might have died before the French ships arrived. But conducting the rescue led to the bombing that killed additional survivors. If the American aircraft had not attacked U-156, the rescue might have succeeded, and more lives might have been saved. But attacking the submarine was consistent with military doctrine. Every decision point in the Laconia Incident involved impossible choices between competing values and unpredictable outcomes. The only certainty is that 1,500 people died, and approximately 1,200 survived. Everything else is speculation about what might have been. At 8:07 in the evening on September 12, 1942, Werner Hartenstein gave the order to fire torpedoes at an unescorted Allied ship. In that moment, he was following his training and his orders. He was doing his job as a submarine commander. 4 hours later, he was coordinating a rescue operation, trying to save the lives of people he had endangered. In that moment, he was following his conscience and naval tradition. 5 days later, he was abandoning survivors on orders from his superiors, leaving them to uncertain fates. In that moment, he was following military discipline. 6 months later, he was dead, killed by an American aircraft while commanding U-156 off Barbados. His submarine was sunk with all hands. His legacy is the Laconia Incident, a tragedy caused by war, complicated by mercy, ended by violence. The incident killed 1,500 people, saved 1,200, and changed submarine warfare doctrine for the rest of the war and beyond. Hartenstein's action demonstrates that individual moral courage can exist within systems designed for killing, but also that such courage is often futile when confronted with the logic of total war. The Laconia Incident is a story about the limits of humanity in modern warfare. It is a story about the impossibility of reconciling military necessity with humanitarian duty. It is a story about what happens when submarines, which are designed to kill without warning, attempt to rescue the people they have endangered. The story's moral is that such attempts cannot succeed. The weapons are too effective. The tactics are too brutal. The war is too total. Werner Hartenstein tried anyway. He failed. But the attempt matters. That is what the Laconia Incident teaches, that moral action in warfare is often futile, but remains necessary. That duty to the living can coexist with responsibility for the dead. That enemies can cooperate even when their nations are committed to mutual destruction. And that the laws of war, however carefully written, cannot eliminate the fundamental tragedy that war creates. The Laconia sank on September 12, 1942. 1,500 people died. The rest is argument about who was responsible and what could have been done differently. The argument continues today because the questions raised by the Laconia incident remain unanswered. Was Hartenstein a hero or a war criminal? Was the American bombing justified or a war crime? Was the Laconia order legitimate military doctrine or an abandonment of humanitarian principles? These questions have no final answers. They have only perspectives, contexts, and competing values. The Laconia incident forces us to confront the moral complexity of warfare and the inadequacy of simple judgments. And that confrontation, uncomfortable as it is, represents the incident's most important legacy.